Imagine a world where vast, uncharted lands were whispered about in the courts of Europe, where tales of glittering cities and endless riches ignited the imaginations of kings and explorers alike. Africa, in the 15th century, became the focus of Europe's ambitions. It wasn't just a new destination, it was a promise. A world that could bring wealth, power, and prestige to any nation bold enough to claim it. What drove the mighty empires of Europe to set their sights on Africa, a continent so diverse and full of life? The story is one of economic hunger, spiritual zeal, political rivalry, and cultural arrogance, all woven into a complex narrative that would shape the fate of Africa and the course of world history. In the early 1400s, the heart of Europe pulsed with a newfound curiosity. Stories of unimaginable riches, vast lands, and mystical empires reached noble ears, spoken of by merchants who'd wandered the deserts and traders who had bartered in strange cities. Africa was a mystery, a land that glittered with gold and secrets. To Europeans, it held an allure, like a diamond hidden just out of reach. The great European powers, Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, began to envision a world beyond their borders. They saw Africa as the key to both prosperity and prestige. It was a matter of survival and competition. They sought new trading routes, new territories, and, most importantly, access to the fabled wealth that lay beyond the Sahara. But this curiosity was not purely academic or innocent. The monarchs, the merchants, and the military saw in Africa an opportunity for profit, dominance, and power. If they could conquer its lands and control its resources, their nations would thrive. And so, they set their sights southward. By the 16th century, Europe was transforming. Nations needed resources, gold, silver, timber, and spices, to fuel their economies. Africa was rich with these treasures. Timbuktu, for instance, was known as a hub of trade and scholarship, and the Mali Empire had gold mines that seemed boundless. If Europeans could establish a foothold in Africa, they could bypass the expensive intermediaries they relied on to access these resources. The Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries intensified this need. Factories sprang up across Europe, demanding a constant supply of raw materials. Cotton, rubber, palm oil, diamonds, and more were needed to fuel industrial growth. African colonies would provide cheap and abundant resources, making Africa not just a source of wealth, but a necessity. These resources, combined with African labor, would reduce European dependency on other regions, thus increasing their independence and power. Europe began to see Africa as a kind of El Dorado, a place that could forever transform its economies and secure its dominance in the world. Yet, for all its greed, Europe's motives were not purely economic. Christianity was deeply ingrained in European society, and there was a genuine, if patronizing, belief among many that Africa was a dark continent in need of salvation. Missionaries saw it as their duty to bring Christianity to African societies, whom they viewed as pagan and heathen. This belief merged with a newfound ideology that justified Europe's ambitions under the guise of a civilizing mission. European leaders claimed they would uplift Africans, providing them with education, religion, and what they deemed proper civilization. This moral justification was highly convenient, masking the greed for land and resources behind a righteous cause. This fervor became a tool for empire building, as missionary outposts often preceded colonial conquests. These outposts mapped territories and built relationships with local leaders, who they sometimes manipulated or coerced into alliances. Over time, these missionaries became the scouts and forerunners for colonial armies, smoothing the path for conquest. By the late 1800s, Europe had become a land of rivalries and alliances. Nationalism was at an all-time high, and countries vied for power on the global stage. Africa, with its vast lands and resources, became a stage on which European nations could prove their dominance. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalized this competition. Representatives from major European nations gathered to divide Africa among themselves. They carved the continent into territories without consideration for the native populations. They drew arbitrary borders, splitting tribes, kingdoms, and cultures with the stroke of a pen. Their primary goal was to claim the most land, the most resources, and the most power. For European leaders, colonies were symbols of national prestige. The British Empire, for example, prided itself on being the empire on which the sun never sets, with territories spanning the globe. France, Germany, Belgium, and others followed suit, each nation determined to secure its share of Africa. This was no longer just about economics or religion. It was about proving superiority. A nation's status was tied to its imperial reach, and Africa offered an endless playing field. As European powers entrenched themselves in Africa, they unleashed massive mining and agricultural projects. In the Congo, for instance, Belgium's King Leopold II profited tremendously from rubber and ivory, exploiting both the land and its people. Forced labor systems were imposed, and local populations were often treated brutally, with little regard for their lives or well-being. Africa's resources were shipped back to Europe, feeding industries, building cities, and increasing the wealth of the ruling class. For the average European citizen, life improved as colonial wealth funded social programs, public works, and even health care. Colonial exploitation made Europe prosperous and powerful, while Africa's economies were manipulated, its resources drained, and its people oppressed. The story of Africa's colonization is not one of passive submission. African leaders and communities fought back against European invaders. Leaders like Samorai Toure of the Wassoulou Empire, Menelik II of Ethiopia, and Lobengula of the Ndebele resisted European encroachment with ferocity and skill. In some cases, they managed to hold off European powers for years. Yet, European military technology was far superior. Armed with guns, cannons, and iron ships, Europeans overpowered African kingdoms and societies. Resistance was often met with brutality, but Africa's spirit remained unbroken. Even under colonial rule, Africans found ways to preserve their cultures, languages, and traditions. They resisted in subtle ways through art, music, and religion, keeping alive a sense of identity despite European efforts to erase it. The legacy of colonization in Africa is complex and painful. While Europe reaped the benefits of Africa's resources and labor, the continent itself was left scarred. Colonization disrupted African societies, economies, and cultures, creating wounds that are still felt today. The arbitrary borders drawn by Europeans sowed seeds of ethnic conflict and tension that persist. But Africa's story is not one of defeat. Today, African nations are reclaiming their histories, their cultures, and their voices. Many countries have gained independence, and though the scars of colonization remain, they are building toward a future shaped by their own terms. As the dust settled on Europe's imperial ambitions, it became clear that Africa had been both the catalyst and the victim of Europe's drive for power. The resources, wealth, and labor extracted from the continent helped to build European nations and fuel their growth, but at a tremendous cost. The motivations for European colonization of Africa were many: economic greed, religious zeal, the hunger for power, and a misguided sense of superiority. These forces drove centuries of exploitation and conflict, leaving behind a legacy that is still being reckoned with today. Yet, Africa endures. Through resilience and determination, it continues to define itself and its future. The continent that Europe once coveted now stands with pride, reclaiming its narrative and showing the world that its people, cultures, and stories are more than the sum of their colonial past.